And welcome everyone for this afternoon's webinar. Uh, my role at Prevail is head of product, and it's going to be my pleasure and privilege to moderate a panel discussion format on our program today. And basically just a couple housekeeping items before I do introductions. Um, as I said, Q&A will be available through your Q&A feature within the webinar browser. And just as a side note, due to the specific nature of the information we're going to be discussing today, we'll be avoiding very specific technical details during this webinar in the interest of keeping information private and as appropriate for our audience and for our panelists. And the reason that's important is because we have such a great panel here, and I'm going to introduce our speakers today. A couple of them are from the Redspin organization, and one is also a Redspin customer and has recently underwent their own cybersecurity maturity model certification assessment as a voluntary assessment prior to the official program launch, but we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so first we have Dr. Thomas Graham with us. He serves as a CISO for Redspin, and he's responsible for all the internal security items for their three business units: Synergist Tech, Redspin, and Backbone. Thomas is the chief architect in during Redspin's journey to become the first authorized CMMC C3PAO. Prior to this, he supported Defense Health Agency in a variety of roles where his team received a Fed Health IT Award for Innovation and also received official naval commendations supporting the U.S. Navy. Second, we have Robert Teague. He is Redspin's Security and Assessment Consulting Services Manager and is a certified cybersecurity maturity model certification provisional assessor, that's a mouthful, and a registered practitioner with over 30 years of operational and strategic leadership experience in information technology and cybersecurity operations with the U.S. Army. Robert is an advisor who travels globally to assist clients in preparation for their CMMC certifications, among many other things. And we're particularly happy today to be able to have someone that's actually gone through this voluntary assessment process very recently. And so we're joined also with Zbigniew Kaniewski. Hope I did that justice. He's the CIO for Aero Glen International. He's a cybersecurity maturity model certification registered practitioner, also with 30 plus years of operational and strategic leadership experience in IT. Prior to establishing Aero Glen's cybersecurity program, Zbigniew led global technology teams across multiple industries, including manufacturing, finance, consulting, healthcare, and energy utilities. So as you can see, we have a fantastic panel here today, and let's just jump right in. So to set the stage, we mentioned early that we're going to talk a lot about voluntary assessments and things we're learning about them and sharing that information with our audience. So I want to start off with a few minutes to just kind of set the stage and explain what the voluntary assessment is and who are they designed for, and kind of start us off with a high level of understanding of the voluntary assessment program. And I'll start that off with Robert.
Hi, thanks, Greg. Thanks for having us back, and it's a pleasure to share this information with everybody that's joining the session. This voluntary phase really falls under what they're calling the Joint Surveillance Program. So it is a joint assessment with DIBCAC from Department of Defense and the C3PAOs to do a joint assessment on organizations seeking certification. So the big question that we get a lot is, does DIBCAC do their assessment first, then the C3PAO does theirs? No, it is joint. So as the C3PAO is doing the NIST 800-171 practices for CMMC, DIBCAC is in there also doing their DIBCAC High certificate. The C3PAO leads the assessment process. So as we move through the domains in each of the practices, once we finish the domain, we usually pass it off to DIBCAC and ask them if they have any clarifying questions, which sometimes they would address. Other times they were satisfied with the questions that we had asked. So that should satisfy the big question of how that operates. So the DIBCAC is a joint process with the C3PAOs.
Thanks, Robert. So as a follow-up, I think, Thomas, can you characterize how this voluntary assessment phase is different from what we are generally calling the CMMC assessments that are going to come after rulemaking?
Sure. So as Rob mentioned, under the joint surveillance phase, it is two different teams. It is DIBCAC and then the C3PAO. Whereas the C3PAO, they're focusing on the items under NIST requirements. DIBCAC actually includes some additional items that are under the DIBCAC high assessment, particularly within regards to some of the DFARS requirements. I know, just going through the recent assessment, there was a couple of conversations where we had concluded what we needed as the C3PAO for CMMC, but the DIBCAC folks then had probably a handful of questions for Aero Glen as it relates to specifics in the DFARS and is outside of the current CMMC requirements. But other than that, it's honestly what you would expect. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of artifacts that you have to show. There's live demonstrations that are requested, as well as, if you have on-prem operations with regards to your infrastructure, you'll still have somebody come probably pay you a visit at least for one day before, the OSC decides to kick them out and get them out of their hair.
Great, thanks. So that really helps us set the stage, kind of understanding what it is Zbigniew and his team went through during their recent assessment. So this one's for you, Z. Why did you go through the voluntary assessment program? What was your kind of business thinking around, why now, and what was your rationale for that?
Yeah, these guys made it sound very easy. But for us, the decision was pretty straightforward or simple. Our original goal was to get certified under 1.0. As we all know, that didn't really materialize and evolved into 2.0. By summer of this year, we felt we were ready, and in having conversations with the Redspin team and trying to understand where the DoD was on greenlighting the whole assessment process, it's kind of when the news came down on this is going to be a joint assessment. While we really didn't know the details of what that meant, it did cause some concern initially, but in the end, it was one of those where we always knew we wanted to have an outside party come in and do an assessment on our cyber defense capabilities. And if it meant that it's going to be a 2-for-1 deal, great. So it really didn't phase us in that respect. And in the end, if it means that we do gain a competitive advantage short term, we'll take it.
Great, excellent, thank you. Okay, so why don't we get into a little more specifics now? Once a company makes a decision they want to go after this project and have set a clear goal for attaining an assessment, what are the prerequisites for receiving this assessment? And can any contractor ask for one, or are there certain steps or prerequisites that are required before a contractor can get started? And I guess we'll start with Robert on that one.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Greg. Currently with the Joint Surveillance Program, the DIBCAC opted to pick the first 4 organizations based off their cage codes and then prioritized them from there. We were notified that Z and his team at Aero Glen were one of the first 4. So we started working with them a few weeks out to make sure we had access to their environment so that we could start phase 1, which was the objective evidence review. Had some questions as we went through phase 1, but not too many. Most of it came out in phase 2. So any organization that is out there, our big question for DIBCAC, which we're still waiting on an answer on, is they intend on kind of phasing themselves out as we move forward with these assessments and relying mostly on the notes from the C3PAO. So as we sit through the phase 2 portions, for example, with Z and his team at Aero Glen, we take those notes and pass them off to the DIBCAC team. They review them, and then they do their part while we do ours. So what we're kind of unsure of now is the DIVCAT going to pick the next 4, OSCs based off their cage codes, or are they going to look at us and say, okay, Redspin and other C3PAOs continue to, set up the next set of interviews, et cetera, and let us know your schedule. So we're kind of hanging in the balance with that. But any organization that is seeking a level 2 certification needs to go through the C3PAO. I believe there's 23 of us now. So they simply start by reaching out to one of the 23 on the marketplace, and then start the discussions.
Great. Yeah, and for the audience, that's the Cyber AB marketplace. If you're looking specifically where they list out all the RPs, RPOs, C3PAOs, registered training providers, all that stuff. So there's a good source of information there. All right, so we heard a little bit about why we want to do this, how we get started, what are the steps. I think I'll go back to Zbigniew with this one. So you said a minute ago we made it sound easy. So what exactly did your company do to get ready? How long did it take? Like, how would you characterize the experience for our audience?
So we had started early 2020, so 2.5 years ago. The first thing we did, and I'm not even sure if at the time CMMC was officially announced yet. If I remember, we were strictly at the time focused on DFARS 7012 compliance and 800-171. So I don't know if the 1.0 framework was out yet. But our first step was, let's just do an internal assessment of where our gaps are. The net result of that, after a few months of doing that, was we recognized we needed to launch a full program to get compliant and meet the requirements. I think the biggest thing that came out of that for us was recognizing that, one, not only are we going to do this to meet the requirements, but more importantly, that we as an organization want to use this as an opportunity to shift our company's thinking on cyber in general and shift the culture around cyber. So now we're not just ticking off the box, but try to get through a complete mindset change for our management team and users to do that. So a lot of conversations at the management level, great support from them. And frankly, I don't know if I could have done it without their support from the top down to get there. So once we've launched, it really came down to kind of two bifurcations in our efforts. One, chasing technology solutions that meet those needs, because we did have some gaps in those areas, but at the same time, documentation, specifically policies, in a lot of cases, writing those from scratch. That took some time. Finally, when those were done, then we went through aligning our procedures to those policies. Once we moved that significant amount, we then attempted to just live what we built. Through that, ton of learning and lessons and improvements and changes and iterations, and a continued almost reassessment on an ongoing basis of each of the controls. And every time we've gone into one of the controls, we learned a lot more or gained a lot more understanding of what each of those controls was doing or what it meant. And that just fed into the cycle of kind of continually improving on our processes. Probably one thing worth mentioning, we chose not to engage an RPO or a 3CPAO to help us. We ended up doing it ourselves. One of the thinking was that if we are going to attempt to shift the culture and live cyber going forward, we should own it instead of outsourcing it. So that was kind of our mentality around that one.
Yeah, cultural change does not come quickly, right? And like you said, support from the top and takes time to move the culture in a new direction. That's a really interesting story.
Right. We were fortunate in that we're a relatively small company, so moving that isn't as hard as a larger organization, but it still has its challenges.
Yeah, but I can hear the ownership when you talk about it. I think that's great. Okay, so let me back out to Thomas for a minute, and perhaps you could characterize for us. This just sounded like a lot of stuff, right? Taking years and months of work in documentation and technology selection, cultural change. Could you characterize for us, say, what do you see as kind of a typical timeline, and how should companies that are thinking about this journey, how should they be thinking about the time it will take, and when this, how that may fit into the voluntary assessment program or not, and just kind of maybe some advice for folks out there that are thinking about time here.
Sure. So one big distinction I want to make at first, Greg, is when Z and his folks started going through this, keep in mind they started at CMMC V1, which included the maturity requirements that were originally in CMMC. The maturity items now, they're not really in CMMC V2. So that takes, I think part of the lead time that a lot of organizations were looking at off the table. That's not saying that you don't still need policies and procedures. You absolutely have to have those, but the onus is more on ensuring you're doing what you're saying now versus what you may have done 2 or 3 years ago. From a lead time perspective, it depends on the organization. We've had organizations that are trying to move certain segments of their operations under a CMMC type enclave. We've had other organizations stand up an entirely separate new, and I'm going to use the term enclave just as a consolidated container where their CUI lives. We've had organizations do that, and then we've had other organizations that, for whatever reason, are they want to put their entire organization through it. And that's just 3 examples. And for each of those, lead time is very different for each of those, because the other question, that, probably is worth asking is, have you done any validation that you actually have been doing the DFARS requirements that were released, several years ago? If you have validation on that aspect, then you're probably sitting in a good place to start from. And if not, it depends on your organization's commitment. I know, here at Redspin, when we started looking at this, we also started looking at it in 2020. And it took us probably close to a year to get everything worked out. Granted, again, that was under V1, but under V2, some organizations may have an easier time with it. One of the largest, lifts, if you will, is, at least from what I've come to understand from conversations, and this isn't specific to Aero, Glen, is getting the technologies in place that meet the requirements of CMMC. And the reason why I'm saying that is I have an echo in my head from an old information security officer I used to work for, saying words mean something. And what I'm getting at with that is that one of the things you should absolutely do when you're preparing is look through that assessment guide. That's going to tell you what the assessors from the C3PAOs are going to look at. When you're going through that guide, pay attention to the verbiage and the terminology, because there is a very big difference between, and I'm going to pick on encryption here. There's a very big difference between FIPS 140 TAC 2 compliant encryption and FIPS 140 TAC 2 validated encryption. And that's, something you should have an understanding of prior to going into the assessment. And if you do, it could make your assessment go a lot smoother than it otherwise would.
Yeah, if I can also jump in, because Z pointed out a big one that honestly, since the start of CMMC, we haven't really talked too much about, and that's creating the culture within the organization. Everybody knows safety is first, right? But they should also know cyber is first and people are always. So creating that culture is something that I think really separated Aero, Glen, from other organizations that I've seen, because when they were demonstrating the tests, as we would go through the questions, we would ask for examples of like Active Directory so we could see unique user IDs, right? His team drilled right down to every test. Like, you could tell that they weren't just practicing for an exam, if you will. They did this on a daily basis. And that was, I think, made the difference, plus gained a lot of impressions, positive impressions from us at Redspin and the DIPCAC team. The other thing I want to focus on was something Thomas said was about the the maturity processes being removed from 1.0. We kind of took advantage of that with DIBCAC and made sure we were in alignment that if we did go through, the documentation with Aero Glen and we found something wrong or wasn't represented properly, could they make the change then and there? And the answer was yes, because the maturity processes are removed. In 1.0, you had to demonstrate that you utilize those policies and procedures. You don't have to necessarily do that now, although that's what Z and his team did. They focused on building those policies, those procedures, and then built all of their processes around it and make sure they follow it. So as we went through, if there were any type of small corrections to documentation or something simple like that, it was just pointed out, the correction was made, and it didn't have to go into a POAM.
Thanks for that, guys. Just to pick up on that thread, so I think maybe add some more color for our audience around what was the role that DIBCAC played during the assessment. I mean, we said earlier that it was a joint thing and that you would, say address the control and then kind of hand off to them and back and forth. But I'm interested to hear more detail about how did they work? How many people were used on the team? What was the cadence? How did you find the experience working with DIBCAC?
Yeah, so I'll start that one and then pass it to Z. So first of all, the DIBCAC teams contact the OSCs directly. So they directly contacted Z in order to begin the processes to start phase 1. Then they asked Z and his team if it was all right if they wrapped Redspin in. This was a legal issue on the DoD side, making sure they went through the OSC first before the C3PAO. Once that was done and we were all together, in emails, conversations prior, et cetera, we kind of nailed out those details, if you will, and then kind of rolled right through it. The DIBCAC did have on this assessment 2 team members that were very professional, very courteous, obviously very experienced at doing their jobs. We at Redspin opted to develop a full-blown team for this assessment simply because we wanted to get our assessors the experience with the first assessments. So Thomas Graham was our lead provisional assessor. We used one of our 1099 provisional assessors from another authorized C3PAO at CISIV, which was Michael Dempsey. And then I kind of took the QA role. I sat in all the sessions, but didn't really ask much until Thomas had to go down physically to Z's site to do the walkthrough. And then I kind of took the last 2 sessions. So as we were leading the sessions, asking the questions as we moved through the domains, we would pause, ask DIBCAC if they would join in. They were very concerned about taking up our time, as the C3PAO. And I had to keep reminding them, listen, this is the joint effort. So your time is our time. So just make sure that we get all the questions addressed and everything we need in this phase 2 piece, because we certainly don't want to keep going back and bugging Z saying, hey, can you send us this? What about this? Remember, we asked about this. We didn't want any of that. So we tried to keep it locked in as much as possible for phase 2.
I completely agree with what Robert, you said. The initial reach out from DIBCAC that came via email, that did throw us a little bit because we weren't expecting that to be the case. It almost gave us the impression that they will lead the event and you guys were going to be in the background. But like you said, once the legal portions got out of the way, the whole process was actually far better than I was expecting. As we're going through it, it was, you tended to forget that there were 2 teams. It just seemed like one effort. But like Thomas, you mentioned, there was a DFARS component to this, which we did take offline, maybe an hour's worth of discovery sessions and evidence we needed to demonstrate to them. And that was essentially it. The bulk of the DFARS components were embedded in NIST 800-171 anyways, but there were a few that fell out of it. But like Robert said, it was cordial, flexible, professional, good team to work with. Don't be afraid, guys.
Yeah. Also, I want to point out that the DIBCAC team, when they first contacted the organizations, were you know, a lot of the documents they originally send for the OSCs to fill out and prep for their piece of it, everything said on site. So that created a lot of concerns, not just for Aero Glen, but the, you know, the other OSCs that were picked as the first four. So it had a lot of hair stand up on the back, like, oh my goodness, we're going to have this full entourage of people just bombarding our environment. That was not the case. All of the sessions were virtual. So we used like Teams or Zoom platforms. The only part that was on site were the physical for the PE portion and the PS portion. So it was about 10 questions where both DIBCAC and Redspin sent a member out to Z's organization to do the walkthrough, but everything else was virtual.
That's a great story, and I really appreciate the extra detail, because I'm sure that's where people are curious, like, what exactly was this like? Now, you piqued my curiosity though on one topic, Thomas. You mentioned they looked into DFARS as part of their scope, which is obviously a little, you know, maybe something new to some people. Can you say more on what did they look at, and which aspects of DFARS were important?
So Z can probably give you a little bit more details on some of the particulars of DFARS, but the reason why they did that is because, keep in mind, this is called a joint surveillance program. And the reason for that is that the CMMC final rule isn't out yet. The draft, to our understanding, is supposed to come somewhere around March, and the final rule sometime in May. So until that takes place, and the reason why DIBCAC is a part of these assessments is you're actually going through what's considered a DIBCAC high on their side. And once the assessment is completed, providing an organization passes under the Joint Surveillance Program, they would be issued a DIBCAC high certification. Now, with that, the organization has to meet the DIBCAC high requirements. Once the final rulemaking takes place, our understanding is that at that point in time, provided the organization met the requirements of CMMC, then they would be issued a CMMC certification via the C3PAO. But Z, I don't know if you wanted to speak on any of the separate particulars around DFARS that DIBCAC looked at for you guys.
Sure. So if you guys are not familiar with the clauses within 7012, if I remember right, it's letters A through M are the subcomponents or clauses within it. We ended up going through each one of those letters one at a time. A chunk of them, the first few, are handled part of 800-171, so they were just part of the assessment. But the most of them, the majority of them, were handled offline, going through each one of them. So take the time to read through each one of those clauses, make sure that you've got those covered and you understand what they are, because they will ask for evidence of that.
And the other thing they looked at was the practice 1311, which I think centers around encryption. So typically what we did, and you know, every C3PAO is probably going to operate differently, but we just set a meeting session for the entire day. And, you know, as folks took breaks, took lunch, we kept the session open so that we wouldn't have to keep dialing back in. Once we got to the point where DIBCAC needed to do the DFAR 7012 questions for Z and his team, Michael, myself, and Thomas just kind of dropped off the session and left it open for Z and the DIBCAC team to run through those. And then when they were done, they just finished for the day. So each morning we started the day with a debrief of what we went over the day previously. What did we miss? We kind of went over the things that we captured as gaps, et cetera, just to make sure everybody was tracking the same things, mainly so that, and a lot of them were low hanging fruit, so that Zeke and his team could operate in the background and remediate those prior to the end of the week, which was kind of what was going on. So it worked out really well.
Great. Just one last question on DFARS, just to be clear, because we get a lot of questions about one particular aspect of the 7012 requirement. It has to do with the media preservation and reporting of incidents. So that's part of what they looked at, right? So that commonly what's referred to as the C through G paragraphs of 7112. that was in scope according to DibCAC, right? Not for the C3PAO portion, but for the DibCAC portion, right?
Correct.
Correct.
Even as part of the demonstration, we needed to demonstrate ability to log into DibNet. So if you don't know what that is, look into it. So that you needed to demonstrate that you can submit a report, and you got the capability to do it. Flow down requirements were also items that were covered. So make sure you cover that with, if you're on any contracts that have subs, cover the flow down requirement as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really the question we get the most, is all around how those requirements flow down, and there's you know, various levels of understanding in the market as far as like what applies to whom, and there's a lot of there's a little homework to be done there, I think. So that's good advice from you guys. All right, well, we spent a lot of time on DFARS, but I thought that was important because it's really not part of the 800-171 rank and file controls, even though the 7012 clause itself is what invokes the 800-171 requirement for CUI. So it's an interesting thing that, you know, has other aspects on top of that really, that was why I want to spend a little more time on it. All right, so now let's talk about, you know, we've talked a lot about the work and what happened and kind of what the experience was like and what we needed to do to get ready. Let's now maybe switch to takeaways or lessons learned from our audience, and this is probably to everyone, but you know, if you could give a message to our defense contractor base out there, and we'll start with Z because I think he's closest to home with this. And you know, what would your advice be to our audience if they want to consider going through this process?
All right, I'll throw out two things I think worked well in our favor, and one thing I wish we did differently. First one, I think I touched on earlier, start early. And what I really mean by that is, as you develop your policies and then your procedures, give plenty of time to burn them in and live them. And that includes your tools. Let the teams use them, let the users use them, experience the policies, the procedures, whether that's through your help desk, change management, whatever it is. And then take the time to update, modify, improve them as you need to. Robert touched on this earlier. In fact, during one of the outbreak sessions, he had used the term muscle memory, and that we had demonstrated muscle memory. And the only way we could have really done that, or anyone can do that, is by you doing it over and over again, and not simply preparation for an audition, but more for because you're going to live it, right? And it sounds like that came through. That was one of the kind of subconscious things we were doing as part of our culture and change to live it. If we're going to build it, let's live it and own it. So it sounds like that worked out well. Another aspect I think that was worth the time we put into it, which I wasn't sure at the time, is the documentation, specifically around the evidence. For each of the controls, we had taken a time to actually build a deck of screenshots, documentation, verbiage around what we're doing for each of the controls. And frankly, it forced us to be honest around, did we meet that objective or not? You know, as you're writing it down, you can't argue it in your head around, yeah, I think that's close enough, and move on. It forces you to say yes or no on that. So I think it set us up to, at least through the assessment, avoid any unnecessary basic questions and jump right into demonstrate it to me, etc. And Robert, Thomas, feel free to comment on that when you get your chance. The part that I wish we did better, and I think Thomas, you touched on it, FIPS. While there's all this debate around FIPS compliant versus FIPS validated, and going into the assessment, I understood the difference between the two. What I didn't expect was how black and white it was going to be. And in DibCAC's vernacular, there is no such thing as FIPS compliant. There's only validated. So keep that in mind. If you don't have the certs or the documents or the letters to back up that you got FIPS validated technology, start working on that.
Yeah, and also on the back end of that, as we came across those, Z and his team were contacting the vendors directly. So be prepared to do that in case you need some kind of documentation from them via your, depending on your firewall vendors, etc. You may have to contact them to get those certs updated. From a assessment standpoint, I think what made the assessment really successful, in Redspin's opinion, is the fact that Z had administrators sitting in the sessions, in the interview sessions with them. A lot of them, they were part of the questions, so they were answering a lot of our questions. But more importantly, the assessors can ask it on any one of the practices for a live demonstration, and it's just random when they will ask. There's certain things DibCAC likes to search for, and they mentioned those to Z. But for us, it was just random. If we felt it was important, we wanted to see a live demonstration. So his folks actually had their consoles in the interview rooms and were able to screen share with us those live demonstrations. And you can watch them clicking right on through all of the different user-facing stuff to get to where we needed to see what the configurations were. And again, that was that muscle memory, because they were just clicking on it like they had been doing it for years. And that's how an organization. It stood out to me. Thomas recognized it, Dempsey recognized it, so did DibCAC, that these guys are actually living what they preach, and what they said they were going to do. It was very, very prominent.
All right, Thomas, maybe you have anything else to add in terms of lessons learned, advice to contractors looking at this as a upcoming project or goal for their organization, and then we won't have a lot of time left after that, and we may move to live Q&A after that. So
sure. I mean, probably, my first piece of advice I'm going to pull from a movie, and that's my advice to you is start drinking heavily. No, I'm joking. I guess the biggest advice I would have is, we've touched on before, how DFARS has been around for a while. And if you've been doing DFARS, that should give you a good baseline. However, I highly advise, honestly, a couple of things. One, look through the documentation. Look through the assessment guide, look through NIST 800-171, and start identifying, honestly, how and where you meet that. If you do that, that's going to be your roadmap for pretty much everything else. The second thing that I would advise organizations to do is don't wait. There is a lot of rumors out there. There's a lot of folks, a lot of talking heads. If you continue to wait, once this becomes live, once the final rule hits, then you're not only going to be dealing with trying to get everything in place in a consolidated time frame, because keep in mind, if the final rule does come out in May, the end of the fiscal year, comes in September. So CMMC becomes real the 1st of October. That only gives you a few months to do all this, not only to do it, but then also to become assessed. And I mentioned that part because, as Rob mentioned, there's not hundreds of assessors out there. Well, I should say there's not hundreds of assessment organizations out there. So you're also probably going to be dealing with some type of backlog at that point in time. And that's why I know several times when we've talked, with you guys, Greg, we've mentioned, don't wait on this. Go ahead, start doing it now. It's not going away. It's not something that's going to be swept under the rug, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and a key takeaway to focus on, because Z kind of hit the head on it, so did Thomas. They both said the same thing, is that we started this a while ago. It didn't just happen overnight. These were processes that were thought about long ago in strategic planning, started to put them in place, developed them, worked them, moved the kinks out of them, and continued to get clear objectives that the organization could meet. It doesn't happen overnight, right? So for those that haven't prepared, like Aero, Glen, and Redspin have, don't panic, right? There's organizations out there that can assist you if you need the assistance. but basically just, it's really locking down time to focus on the documentations. And then as Z said, build everything around it to make sure you're living what you say you're doing.
Good advice. That's helpful. Okay, so let me switch gears and we'll switch over to some live Q&A. The questions are coming in through the queue now. A couple of them are very specific and things we didn't cover, but were adjacent to the topics we already did talk about. So I think those are good questions because they provide a little extra clarification. So one of them was specific to Appendix E and the controls that are not specifically assessed but are expected in NIST 800-171. So how are those handled in this case?
Well, I'm just going to say quite plainly, they're required. They're in NIST 800-171. I mean, if you start looking at Appendix E, one of the first of those requirements is documentation, policies, and procedures. Whenever CMMC V2 come out, one of the prevailing rumors was that, oh, you no longer need policies and procedures because those have been taken out of the CMMC specific controls. That's not accurate. What they took out was the maturity of that documentation. You are still expected to have it. And as you know, pointed out, it's part of Appendix E in NIST 800-171. So if you don't have, and I'm just using documentation as the example, if you don't have it, highly suggest you start looking at it. You know, just looking at, you know, at one of the other ones that I can remember off the top of my head that I'm pretty sure is in Appendix E as an NFO item is around awareness and training, and that's your security training records. You know, when you're going through CMMC, when you get to the AT section, okay, how are you tracking who has completed the training? Where is this located at? Can you show it to us? These are questions that are going to come up in the assessments. So the short answer is yes to your question, Greg.
Yeah, the other thing is that, you know, when you look at NIST 800-171, a lot of the practices are just a high look, you know, the way they're written. For example, asset management. I mean, that to properly do asset management, you have to account for everything that's on the network, everything from printers all the way up, you know, and a lot of folks forget about printers and multifunction devices. We bring those up because that's what we're drilling into. If Z didn't have the answer, he said, hey, we'll get this fixed. He added it to his quick poem and then they adjusted things. If they did have it, we asked for a demonstration to see the list of devices and he provided it for us. So we're going to drill down into the questions is the bottom piece of this, right? We're not necessarily going to ask NFOs, right? Or somebody asked that question about NFOs. We're not really focused on that, but we are drilling down on the questions and we're digging in deep. When we say devices, we're not just going to talk about servers and laptops. We're going to talk about the switches, the routers, and all those things, right?
Yeah, that's good. So I think might be fair to say that the Appendix E, you can't really implement an 800-171 program without doing the Appendix E things, right? So otherwise your program really isn't complete. So I think, so to your point, I think, you know, they may not be directly assessed, but they are required, right? You really have to have that stuff to have a real program. I guess that's one guy's opinion anyway. All right, so here's another specific one that I think is really good because we talked a lot about process, but we didn't talk about methodology very much specifically. So what guidelines or guidance methodologies did you see being followed? Did they use, for example, was the CAP used, the draft CAP that's out now, or what what basic 800-171 methodology was followed, for example? And
yeah,
anyone can jump in on these now.
Yeah, I guess I'll tackle that one. So we did follow the CAP document, although very loosely. The Cyber AB did not want that to be a prominent document in this joint phase. So we relied and went to it every now and then, but mostly just we used NIST 800-171 And then NIST 800-171 Alpha talks about how you do the assessment. We did use from CMMC 1.0 because we don't have any templates yet from the AB. They're still being drafted and developed. So we use the old intake form from CMMC 1.0 that was developed way back when. We also used the CMMC assessment plan and built that out because we're going to need those. We'll just have to copy them into the new templates once they're released, but we need those in order to issue the certificate once we upload those.
Yeah, if I could jump in from Glen's perspective, it wasn't really obvious if you were using the CAP document. It was clear there was a methodology in the background, but it wasn't clear exactly what. You guys had your specific areas for each of the objectives you were looking for, which follow closely the assessment guide. But it wasn't clear from where we were sitting as to what document you were using to walk through each of the controls.
Good, thank you. Okay, I'm just kind of scanning questions again. This one's come up a couple of times, so and it's very specific to something Thomas mentioned earlier, which is, you know, if COI can be, I guess, segregated or isolated into what we called an enclave. Questions are coming in saying like, well, how do you do that? How do you build an enclave? Is there any advice or point of view you guys can give the audience on how to kind of look at COI as a segregated set of data?
Sure, I guess I can start with that one and then see if you want to provide any context from Glen's point. But there's a couple of ways you can do it. If you have all on-prem, you can basically designate part of your infrastructure as being where that CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted, and keep everything that's non-CUI related off of those. Another way that a lot of organizations have been doing that is creating what's called virtualized enclaves. And that's through the use of tools such as GCC High from Microsoft, or, you know, some of the other providers, and then utilization of some type of VDI, virtual desktop, to access it with the controls then on the VDI that prevents that data from going to a physical system. That's just a couple of the ways that we've seen organizations start to tackle it, to kind of carve out that separate area. Z, I don't know if you wanted to provide any other context, you know, when you guys decided what you ultimately did.
But when we first started, to be frank, CUI was everywhere. And then more importantly, we grappled with what exactly is CUI. And the answers aren't that obvious out there. There's no one's going to tell you, oh, here it is and whatnot. But as we've gone through the controls and the process and implement our policies, it finally became clear for us as to what that is and allowed us to scope things down. So as we've gone through it, by year 1, year 2, it got honed in. We got control of where our CUI was, and reached a point where we felt we could have done an enclave. But given where we were at that point, and to me, the philosophy of building an enclave to segregate it out, while it may have merit, where it conflicted for us was that if we're going to want to build a culture of cyber awareness and being defenses for the entire organization, restricting it down to a subset would give us an out for everyone to go, oh, that only applies to this component of our company, not everything else, right? So we opted to say, you know, while we contained our CUI to a limited set of servers in this case, the entire org was still in scope for us, and all of the controls still apply to it. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's there's a lot of different ways to get there, so it's always insightful to hear how particular companies have approached the problem set. So this brings up another question that was also mentioned a bunch of times. Now, this one is not an easy one to answer, so but I think it's on the minds of a lot of folks grappling with this current set of requirements, and that is, what about managed service providers and cloud services, and how should a company that's using these things to provide IT capabilities to the organization, how does that fit into the compliance regime and requirements, and what kinds of questions should we be asking our cloud providers or our MSPs? How do we know we're good there, or that those choices represent risk to compliance?
Yeah, I guess I'll start this one because I talk about this a lot. So does Thomas. Currently, the DoD is still addressing how they're approaching cloud service providers and managed service providers. Because they're still addressing that, there's nothing out there stopping an organization from picking whoever they would like to use. A lot of folks are actually seeking out MSPs and CSPs that may be FedRAMP moderate, FedRAMP high, or equivalent, because they're anticipating reciprocity is going to come from DoD. That's already been mentioned by the CIO, the deputy CIO, but it's still not addressed. So how did we approach it? Whatever documentation that we'll use cloud service provider, they provide to the organization, that's part of our objective evidence review. We go through that documentation to make sure the cloud service provider is also meeting the intent of the practices. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and any other things to add from you folks? I know it's kind of a very open-ended question, but we hear about it a lot.
Well, I mean, with regards to it, as Rob mentioned, right now the prevailing conversation has been around FedRAMP moderate or equivalent is kind of going to, the thought process is that may be the baseline. However, and thinking back to a previous, conversation we had with Prevail, Greg, in the conversation, it was talking about the FedRAMP certifications of, I think, some of the Microsoft solutions. And the reason why, some of the conversations around FedRAMP moderate are still going on is because if you look at Microsoft, they have on their website, commercial tenant can meet the requirements of FedRAMP moderate. However, if you dig into it, they actually do a comparison, and their implementation of FedRAMP does not provide the protections that are required for CUI, and that's Microsoft's own attestation under the commercial platform. So when you're looking at those FedRAMP moderate, FedRAMP high, those are great benchmarks to start looking at. Definitely it gives you a leg up in the process, but when you're going through the assessment, you as the OSC are still going to have to show how that third-party MSP or CSP is addressing any CUI that they may have in their environment. I know when we went through our own assessment, we still had to do that, even though we went a notch above. But that was one of the questions that got asked our way.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the other piece is, I think the DoD is kicking around. Does that mean the CSP or that the MSP needs to do a CMMC certification? Could be, if they're not already FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns, but we are definitely going to take a look at the documentation and make sure they're living to the practices and providing the security that the organization has hired them for. Greg, there's a lot of questions I'm seeing about the actual process, right? So if I can, I'm just going to walk them through a demonstration of kind of how we addressed just one of the practices, and we'll use the first access control. So as Thomas, he read the actual practice that had to be addressed. Then he turned to Z and said, listen, we've reviewed your documentation. We know you got a policy for access control. We know you got your procedures. You've also provided us artifacts showing screenshots of everybody's in Active Directory with their user IDs, et cetera, et cetera. Could you do us a favor and show us live your Active Directory so that we can see that? his team screen shared their console, opened Active Directory, and we could see the list of users. Another test example was Z is, authorizing the appropriate personnel access to CUI. So we wanted to see somebody that wasn't authorized to access CUI data to try and get into that environment. So they picked one of their folks. They logged into their account and tried to get into the area where the CUI was, and a big screen, the big flash comes on the screen that says you're not authorized to access such and such. And that was a live demonstration that checked the block for us. So it's kind of those things as you move through. I mean, here at Redspin, the other C3POs were probably going to operate the same, but we wanted to make sure that Z and his team knew that, yes, this is the practice. We did review your documentation, and it does say this. The artifact shows that documentation, right? We just want a live picture of it to make sure it's all closed looped.
Just to add to that, I think throughout the day, I probably shared my screen 70% of the time. So a bunch of the time that day, we were sharing, whether it was a document, a screenshot, or an actual system live. So be prepared for that.
Great. All right, I'm going to have to let that be the last word because we are out of time. That went by very quickly. Thanks again to Thomas, Robert, Zbigniew. Great insights and information that I'm sure our significantly large audience found helpful. So that was great, and I'm glad you could join us today. There are a whole bunch of questions we couldn't get to because of time. We are going to do those offline and try to have a response to the additional questions that we weren't able to make live on the webinar. But again, thanks to all our attendees as well. Glad you could spend some time with us, and we'll turn everyone back to their day.
Yeah. Good luck, everybody, on your journey.
Thank you, guys.
Z, thanks a lot. We appreciate you, buddy.
No problem.
Have a
Thanks.
good one.
All right, guys.